Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This morning we'll be having a sutta study with Ayya Soma and myself, Bhante Suddhaso. And we'll be talking a bit about Majjhima Nikaya number 67, the Chatuma Sutta. So we can begin by paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll speak some words of Dhamma related to this discourse. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sangham Namasami. So this particular discourse, the Chatuma Sutta, it centers around, well, it starts with a story of a group of monks coming to visit the Buddha, but being very noisy and talking a lot and making a lot of noise. And the Buddha basically tells them, okay, I don't want these noisy people around. And actually, this is a theme which we find in many places in the suttas. In many places in the suttas, we find comments from non-Buddhist people saying things like, oh, these Buddhist monastics, they love silence. They love quiet. They don't like it when people are loud. They don't like it when people are talkative. They don't like it when people are noisy. So there's actually, it's something we find a few places in the suttas, is there's a group of non-Buddhist people and they see a group of Buddhist monks coming and they say like, okay, let's stop talking. Because if they hear us talking, then they won't want to get close to us. They won't approach us. But if we're silent, then maybe they'll come and we can have some interaction with them. So on this occasion, it's a group of monastics, so junior monastics, coming to visit the Buddha and making lots of noise, and the Buddha tells them to go away. In this translation, it actually, he literally says to them, "Go away, monks. I dismiss you. You are not to stay in my presence." So the Buddha would sometimes speak in a very direct way, which these days we might consider to be a bit rude, but I knew he was the Buddha, so he clearly wasn't being rude. He was just being clear and straightforward, which I actually find quite delightful. But then where this comes to is that then the Buddha then gives a bit of an explanation about the conditions under which somebody might misapprehend monastic life. They might take up monastic life with the wrong attitudes and wind up disrobing as a result. And this centers around 4 similes. And so at this point, I think it would be useful for Ayya Soma to read from the sutta about these 4 similes. So it's about the 4 dangers of when one goes into the water. And he analogizes this to 4 dangers when one enters monastic life. Okay, please.
Right, thank you, Bhante. I will be reading from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. So the Buddha says, monastics, there are these 4 kinds of fears to be expected by those who go down to the water. What are the 4? They are fear of waves, fear of crocodiles, fear of whirlpools, and fear of sharks. These are the 4 kinds of fears to be expected by those who go down to the water. So too, monastics, there are 4 kinds of fears to be expected by certain persons who have gone forth from the home life into homelessness in this Dhamma and discipline. What are the 4? They are fear of waves, fear of crocodiles, fear of whirlpools, and fear of sharks. What, monastics, is fear of waves? Here some clansperson goes forth out of faith from the home life into homelessness, considering, I am a victim of birth, aging and death, of sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. I am a victim of suffering. a prey to suffering. Surely an ending of this whole mass of suffering can be known. Then, after they have gone forth thus, their companions in the holy life advise and instruct them thus. You should move to and fro thus. You should look ahead and look away thus. You should flex and extend the limbs thus. You should wear the patched cloak, bowl, and robes thus. Then the monastic thinks, formerly, when we were in the home life, we advised and instructed others. And now these monastics, who seem like they might be our sons or our grandsons, think that they can advise and instruct us. And so the monastic forsakes the training and reverts to the low life. They are called one who has forsaken the training and reverted to the low life, because they were frightened by the fear of waves. Now, fear of waves is designation of anger and irritation. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah, so this first one, this is very common. I mean, actually, all four of these are very common. But this first one is that, so again, often we have a dislike of being told what to do. We want to be the masters of our own destiny, as people sometimes say. We want to have the freedom to make our own choices and do what we want and say what we want and go where we want and act in the way that we want. But in monastic life, we're actually working on changing our mode of being, changing our mode of living to a style which helps to support the reduction of ego, reduction of self-centeredness, reduction of this constant me-making and mind-making, this constant story of self that we're living in. And also entering into a new mode of life where, again, maybe as a layperson, we were experts in our field, or we were maybe the owner of our own business, or we had some success in whatever we were doing. But when we enter monastic life, suddenly we're at the absolute bottom of the rung. We know nothing, which means we're dependent upon the instructions and advice we receive from those more senior to us. But this can be quite upsetting. So it mentions here this example of someone who they entered monastic life, and maybe they're actually quite a bit physically older than the senior monks. So it says here, these people who could be our children or grandchildren. So maybe somebody who's 15 or 20 years younger than you is giving you orders because they've been at the monastery a few years longer than you have. And again, this can be deeply upsetting to one's sense of self, deeply upsetting to one's sense of self-importance. So this particular danger here of getting angry or irritated with one's fellow companions because they're telling you what to do, and it's unavoidable, it's inescapable. This is a central element of monastic life. So those are a few words. Do you want to say anything else about this particular one?
Yes, well, thank you, Bhante, for sharing all those reflections. What I particularly like, and actually about all of these four, that we'll also see the next three very soon, is how the Buddha points out, first and foremost, our aspiration to go forth. So that it's actually rooted in fact, wanting to attain the cessation of suffering. And then actually, once we take these vows, we get into a sort of a little bit, from a lofty sort of kind of aspiration, we find ourselves dealing with some kind of more worldly sort of obstacles, and that being obviously a shift, perhaps, of values. Usually, as lay people, we tend to think of elderly people in terms of age. So people who are worthy of respect in terms of age, how long they've been around in the world. Also, we usually talk about wisdom in that sort of kind of framework. And within monastic life, actually, well, the Buddha actually established a very simple hierarchy, which means essentially whoever went first is more senior. And sometimes that can happen to coincide with age, as in someone has been a monastic for quite a long time, and so he's they are, he, she, they are old in vasa and also old physically. But sometimes actually someone, the oldest one in vasa might be the youngest one of the community. And so it's just very human. Since the time of the Buddha, since ancient India, there can be just the difficulty of adapting to this new sort of framework, and also all the habits that perhaps we have as lay people. So perhaps we have lived by ourselves, or perhaps we had even a family, but it was a small family, and perhaps we were the heads of the family, and so we could decide what kind of decoration, for example, we would have in our room, or if we didn't have any decoration at all, or if we had one particular type of furniture, or or yeah, anything that was useful, that we perceived as needed. And there was this kind of sort of agency on our life. But then we go into a monastery, we start living with others, we take dependence on teachers, and all of a sudden, there's people that tell us, well, actually, you need a desk, or you don't need a desk altogether, or in your kuti there will be a chair, or there won't be any chair, or there will be this type of bed and not this other type of bed. And so it can sound a little bit constrictive, it can sound a little bit oppressive, it can be it can affect us in our sort of sense of self deeply, especially if the person is younger than us. So we can obviously, maybe it's the sort of age of our child. And it's just really human and natural to have that sense of that emotion of irritation, that emotion of just anger, even when having to deal with something that we find a little bit irrational. And so I find this very human, essentially, how the Buddha is describing to us what kind of danger can happen in the mind. And maybe when we're living it, it feels like so unique to our experience, so real, so tangible. But then we're kind of like, oh, it's been happening for quite a long time, actually, since beginningless time. And then it gets a little bit sort of, that it's not as, the sting is not as potent as it might feel. We can go like, oh yeah, that's just, it's just the nature of all of this.
The other thing I would add to this is that so when he talks about again saying like, oh, these people who could be our children or grandchildren. So at first glance, the most straightforward way of interpreting that is in terms of physical age, but also can be related to a more general sense of superiority. So maybe the senior monk actually is physically older than you, but you perceive them as having less knowledge than you, or less experience than you, or less wisdom than you, or maybe even think that their practice isn't as advanced as yours is. But whether any of that is true or not is actually completely beside the point. It's recognizing that entering into monastic life, one is actually setting aside the whole conceit of superiority or inferiority. And this is actually one of the values of this arbitrary seniority system that we use in monastic life. Is the mere fact that it is arbitrary. It allows us to set aside this usual comparison of I'm better, you're worse, I'm better, I'm worse, you're better. Like, we just set all of that aside, and we're just like, okay, this person's been around a few years more than I have, therefore I'm going to respect their opinions. I'm going to see what I can do to help them out. And the other thing, of course, is that often when we enter monastic life, and actually this applies also to lay people who are newer to Buddhism, in the beginning we think we know everything. It's like, yes, I remember when I first went to the monastery as a layman, and I'd read through the Patimokkha once. And so, of course, I knew everything about the Vinaya. And in my mind, I was a master of the Vinaya. And I saw one of the monks doing something which I thought was breaking a Vinaya rule. And I was horrified, and I was like, "What are you doing? Isn't that breaking rule such and such?" And he looks at me and he's like, "No." And I'm like, "Yeah, what does it have to do with this and that?" And he's like, "Nothing." And I was actually really puzzled by this, and I started doing a bit more investigation, and I found out that I had misunderstood the Vinaya rule. That I had been so convinced of the superiority of my stance that I hadn't realized that I actually had only a superficial understanding of the rule, and I didn't understand its complexities. So this actually is a real danger, is we can get this idea of thinking that we know what monastic life is, that we know what the Dhamma is, that we know what the Vinaya is, and then that can lead to us dismissing the viewpoints and ideas of our seniors. So again, this is not to be misunderstood to think that someone who's more senior is automatically wiser or automatically more knowledgeable. But we should always be questioning, do I actually know as much as I think I do? Is it possible that somebody else might have a different perspective, which will help me to get a better understanding of the Dhamma Vinaya?
Yeah, another thing that comes to mind, thank you, Bhante, for sharing that, is also that we can, come to monastic life with all sorts of resumes and all sorts of accomplishments that we had as lay people. And so there's perhaps certifications or awards that we've had, and all of a sudden they're just completely erased. And perhaps, we have to precisely follow different kind of orders or different procedures that are dictated by people that maybe sometimes don't even know how to read and write. And so there is this kind of elimination of any type of awards and and certificates and anything that we might value in lay life. It just doesn't, it's completely removed. As soon as we shave our head we start putting these clothing, is just we're all kind of deprived by this sort of way through which we kind of create our hierarchies. Even in America, that is somewhat a place that is the least hierarchical in terms of like human realms that I've experienced so far. But there's still, we kind of create these at least internal hierarchies, internal ideas of superiority and inferiority. And when that is not the meter through which monastics relate with one another, it can be very, very difficult. It can just be very difficult, once again, to as Bhante was saying, to just have to follow certain procedures or certain how do you say, ordinin, some commandment sounds weird. Orders, I guess, from people that maybe we don't have an innate respect towards or innate appreciation, and they just simply happen to have more basas than we do. And so it's a constant practice of humility. Actually, I think that's why the Buddha essentially has created this really like very simple way of relating between each other, just based on the day that you were ordained. As simple as that. It doesn't matter how, even if you're like an arhat, you're more junior to the Asutta Vapatujana that has been ordained a day before you or an hour before you, and you'll still have to pay respects, essentially. So it's a practice first and foremost of humility.
Of course, sometimes one conceives oneself to be an arhat, and that creates other problems. There was a case a while back at a monastery I was staying at where an anagarika got the idea that he was an arhat, and said that he should be the one at the front of the line in the Dhamma hall. He should be the one giving the talks. Everybody else should be bowing to him. And of course, the answer was, well, one, no. And two, you're not an arhat.
It's a clear sign of not being an arhat. Actually, what comes to mind precisely is, the householder Uga, one of my favorite people in the canon, that is, well, not an arhat, but a non-returner, and he describes all his like incredible qualities. And one of the incredible qualities of the householder Uga is that actually whenever he meets a monastic, he knows all the essentially the realizations or lack thereof of the monastic, and also their level in Sila, establishment in Sila. And well, regardless, he will actually give alms, the same type of alms to anyone, regardless of their attainments and regardless of their sila. Even when the devas go and tell him, hey, that monastic is, kind of like a crappy monastic, but the other one is really good. He actually is like, oh, my wonderful quality is that I give the same alms to everyone. But then what is really impressive is that as soon as he meets a monastic, even though, they're not, they haven't even entered the stream, they're still in a sutta vapatujana, and he, on the other hand, is a layperson, and realized he always waits for the monastic to give him a Dhamma talk. And if the monastic doesn't give him a Dhamma talk, then he, out of compassion, and I want to emphasize, out of compassion, shares some words of Dhamma with the monastic. So the conceit of superiority is not there. The idea that I'm more tame than you are is not there, but rather there is that incredible quality of humility of the mind, and that incredible quality of compassion of the mind, and that incredible quality of faith for and respect of what this form essentially is, of the inheritance that the Buddha has given us, and on why we have these kind of very simple hierarchies within monasticism that are really just meant to create these conditions for the opening of the heart, rather than to create, the sort of worldly worldly monastic parallel of like, oh, we have this, bishop, archbishop, cardinal, and so forth. That's not the point. That's not what we're trying to do here.
Okay. Would you like to read the second danger?
Yes. I find them all hilarious because, once again, we've all had those thoughts at one point or the other. So what monastics is fear of crocodiles? Here, some clansperson goes forth out of faith from the home life into homelessness, considering, I am a victim of birth, aging, and death, of sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. I am a victim of suffering, a prey to suffering. Surely an ending of this whole mass of suffering can be known. Then, after they have gone forth thus, their companions in the holy life advise and instruct them thus. This can be consumed by you. This cannot be consumed by you. This can be eaten by you. This cannot be eaten by you. This can be tasted by you. This cannot be tasted by you. This can be drunk by you. This cannot be drunk by you. You can consume what is allowable. You cannot consume what is not allowable. You can eat what is allowable. You cannot eat what is not allowable. You can taste what is allowable. You cannot taste what is not allowable. You can drink what is allowable. You cannot drink what is not allowable. You can consume food within the proper time. You cannot consume food outside the proper time. You can eat within the proper time. You cannot eat outside the proper time. You can taste food within the proper time. You cannot taste food outside the proper time. You can drink within the proper time. You cannot drink outside the proper time. Then the monastic thinks, formerly, when we were in the home life, we consumed what we liked and did not consume what we did not like, and so forth. All of basically what was said before. Now, when faithful householders give us food of various kinds during the day outside the proper time, it seems these monastics put a muzzle on our mouths. And so they forsake the training and revert to the low life. They are called one who has forsaken the training and reverted to the low life because they were frightened by the fear of crocodiles. Now, fear of crocodiles is a designation for gluttony. I have to come out here. This was like the biggest struggle I had during monastic life. It was just so triggering to me. And precisely, exactly, it's just so down to earth. This sutta is just amazing. Yeah, because you can enter this monastery and it's full. Like, you go in the kitchen right now, it's just full of stuff, so full of stuff. and you see it and you can't touch it, you can't eat it unless, you know, whoever is in charge of like putting things and offering it to the Sangha decides, you know, that that thing is going to be there. You just can't have it. But, you know, it just makes no sense rationally. You're like, it's there. It was donated to the monastery. It's mine. Why has the almond butter not been put on the table and this peanut butter put on the table? Oh, the almond butter is there rotting. So we can rationalize it, and the mind can be so full of defilement and like, I don't like this, I don't want this, it has to stop, this is so stupid. When I was a lay person, yeah, I could decide, you know, this is more nutritious than the other thing. Like we can actually be so rational. There was another monastic I remember who was also suffering with this thing, and at a certain point really placed it. It's, you know, food is a human's right issue. So his point was literally, you know, that basically this kind of way of living in total dependence on lay people and not having that sort of decision making opportunity essentially of what to eat was an infringement, a breach of human rights. So we can get so intellectual about it, really believe it, and really hate the hell out of this experience. And we can think, yeah, this is, you know, only me. This did not happen, you know, if like, if only I had ordained in Thailand under Ajahn Chah. Well, actually, it would have been worse. If one reads, you know, the biographies of all the monastics who have trained with Ajahn Chah and Ajahn Chah's biography per se, also of how he himself was trained. But yeah, and then we go all the way to the suttas. We see that this is basically, it's just such a human experience. It doesn't matter whether we're in wealthy United States or whether modern United States or whether, you know, it's a more impoverished sort of reality. The human mind is the same, and it just crave, especially food, like so much, you know, especially once we give so much up. Yeah, you know, it's I think there's that saying that junior monastics obsess about food, middle monastics obsess about traveling, and senior monastics obsess about building stuff.
Yeah.
And so there's always this kind of constant chasing for things, constant craving of the mind that goes from one thing to the other. I've done all of them, so I hope that was only arahatship. Not all as a junior monastic.
Yeah, so this particular one of the dangers, it's actually pointing to one of the central things that changes when one becomes a Buddhist monastic, which is our relationship with food. And this is really important because we tend to have very deep-seated emotional complexes in relationship to food. So what food we eat, what food we don't eat, how things are prepared, when they're available to us. These are all things which tend to provoke very strong emotional reactions within us. And also where we tend to have extremely strong attachments and preferences. It's like, oh, well, I like this kind of food, but not that kind. I like food to be this spicy, but not too spicy, but not too bland either. I like it to be hot. Well, actually, if you like hot food, bad news about monastic life. I mean, lukewarm is about the best you're ever going to get. Like hot food ceases to be a part of your life. Lukewarm is pretty good. That is sometimes more than you can hope for. Yeah, so what's that?
It's a pleasant surprise when it is.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's recognizing how we usually have lots of preferences built up around food, and we usually have a pretty clear idea in our mind of what we want to eat and how it should be served and how it should be prepared and what we want it to be like. And the truth is that as a monastic, you are very rarely going to get exactly what you want in exactly the way you want. It's extremely rare. And this is part of the value of the training, is because it's making us really question, our attitudes towards food, and really coming back to these basic principles that we're actually, as monastics, are supposed to remind ourselves every day, that we're just eating in order to maintain our health and support our spiritual practice. So all of those preferences and opinions and ideas we have about food are actually completely irrelevant, as long as we're sustaining our health and our spiritual practice. That's actually the only thing that matters. And so this change of relationship to food is actually a really valuable way of starting to understand the defilements of our mind. My preceptor, Ajahn Prasanno, he would sometimes say, if you can understand desire for food, you can understand desire for anything. Mm-hmm. In other words, these food practices that we take on, they help us to understand these deep primal urges in the mind. And you can understand how these same tendencies of preference and desire apply to everything else in our lives. And actually, at the very root of it all is our sense of self. I like this, I want this, I need this, I prefer this. And so breaking through that can help us make a lot of progress on the path.
Yeah, and I would say that actually a lot of this we can practice as a layperson already. So that's why it's so important to practice from time to time with the 8 precepts. So not eating after noon as well for lay people. Actually, in particular, I was struggling with, as you remember, Bhante, not eating after noon. And it was not necessarily the precept per se, but rather, like there's not anything immoral, right, in having dinner. There's not that like you have dinner and then you go to hell. But rather it's a skillful means that actually creates these conditions of these opportunities to actually see how we are relating to food. And also when there are only certain things allowable, like here, the monastic has this reflection of like, oh, I can only consume this and I cannot consume this. And it's kind of like arbitrary. And we can really go like, what's the whole point of this? And so I remember really struggling so much with the fact that, for example, there was only cheese allowable and like ginger allowable or whatever. And I was like, yeah, I would want everything except for whatever is currently present here. But, then I had to also realize that if pizza had been allowable, I would have hated the hell out of pizza as well. So it wasn't really the point, the subject of what was allowable, what was unallowable, but rather the fact that there was not that agency towards deciding this is, something that can be consumed after noon and this cannot be consumed after noon. And so the mind can be full of craving. At our previous center, at a certain point, we were all on the 8 precepts. I was still a lay person. And we started having these vegan dinners that we were making and we were offering to the neighbors who were not Buddhist. And so it was very interesting actually that we would have all these different volunteers coming because we had a big vegetable garden, so everybody would sort of use all the different ingredients and make food. And the first dinner that we had, I still remember, was made by our friend Nicole, who's originally from Jamaica. And she made this, she was cooking the whole day, this like incredible smell throughout the center. And I was like, oh, wow, this Jamaican food is so awesome. And then the dinner arrives and everybody is eating except for me. And I'm like just looking at everyone full of hatred. My mind is, just having so much dukkha, like imagining, all the incredible experiences that the people are having. And everybody, of course, was commenting. Nicole was is actually a really great cook. So everybody was like, wow, this is the best Jamaican food I've ever had. And I'm like, oh, why can't I have the same experience? And it was just so much dukkha. And then we had the same experience the next week where our friend Sunny had come and made her Chinese dinner. So we were an international group of people. So everybody was kind of contributing a vegan version of the cuisine that they were that they had been brought up with. And yeah, my mind full of defilements and all of this sort of like, what is the point of these precepts? This is so stupid. I used to be so much happier before I went to this monastery. Yeah, the only happiness that there was in life, food, has been taken away from me. And there was also all these like evil thoughts actually coming in, looking at people having what seemed like a pleasant experience and actually not being happy about it, but rather being very envious, being very, like just really unwholesome in the way that one was thinking about the sensual pleasure. May I have this rather than this person? And then also the realization, actually, both Sunny and Nicole, who were very kind, and so they had saved a little bit of food for me the next day to have for lunch. And I remember having this really delicious food the day after, and it being a little bit dukkha, because actually it wasn't as great as my mind had, built it up to be. So I remember going like, oh, how very interesting. I mean, it's really good, yeah, without a doubt, but it's not actually as good as I thought it to be, because when we start building up things in our minds, nothing can really match the experience. It becomes something else altogether. And then, the third week, it was my turn. So it was the Italian dinner. And so I remember spending the whole time doing this vegan parmigiana, eggplant parmesan, I guess you say in English. And I remember, starting to offer food. And in my culture, we really like to offer food to people. So whenever we are, this has nothing to do with Buddhism, whenever we welcome people, the last person really to eat is the person who has made the food. So the priority is always to make sure that our guests are having a good time. And it was so interesting because just by going out of this sort of custom, my mind was so happy to see that people were enjoying the food, and there was no observation and there was no kind of focusing on the fact that I was not eating. I remember thinking, wow, I'm actually practicing mudita. And before I was practicing desire, craving. And the practice of craving, of course, was ruining my experience. My experience was full of dukkha. And right now, my practice of rejoicing in the happiness of others is entirely shifted my experience of the mind. I'm having actually the best time of my life. The best dinner ever is the dinner where I'm not eating, but I'm actually rejoicing in others. And so just by holding this precept, there was this kind of insight in how instead of essentially having that limited happiness of acquiring stuff, that gratification of getting what we like, instead there can be a different type of happiness that is always available to us and that is significantly more precious. So actually now as a monastic, it's one of my favorite practices to actually go out for dinner with lay people. Because essentially I'm not eating and I'm just constantly rejoicing, like, oh, is it good? Oh, wonderful. Oh, sadhu. Oh yeah, like, oh, how great. I'm very happy for that. When I go and see my parents back home and they're having dinner, I'm like, oh yeah, great. I'm really, really happy for you. My friends from my previous life, it's like, oh, fantastic. Yes, great. Yeah, and it's just the best dinners I've ever had in my life were the ones where I have not been eating.
Great. And maybe we can move on to the next one.
Oh yes, that's right.
We still have 2 more to go through.
So what monastics is fear of whirlpools? Here some clansperson goes forth out of faith from the home life into homelessness, considering I'm a victim of birth, aging, and death, of sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. I'm a victim of suffering, a prey to suffering. Surely an ending of this whole mass of suffering can be known. Then, after they have gone forth thus, when it is morning, they dress, and taking their bowl and outer robe, they go into a village or town for alms, with their body unguarded, with their speech unguarded, with mindfulness unestablished, and with sense faculties unrestrained. Then they see some householder, their householder's son, furnished and endowed with the 5 cords of sensual pleasure, enjoying themselves with them. They considered thus, formerly, when we were in the home life, we were furnished and endowed with the 5 chords of sensual pleasure, and we enjoyed ourselves with them. My family has wealth. I can both enjoy wealth and make merit. And so they forsake the training and revert to the low life. They're called one who has forsaken the training and reverted to the low life because they were frightened by the fear of whirlpools. Now, fear of whirlpools is a designation for the 5 chords of sensual pleasure. It's great. Would you like to share some reflections, Bhante?
Yeah, so this is the desire for entertainment, or the desire for pleasant diversions. So the desire for sensory stimulation, sensory pleasure, sensory distraction or entertainment. So it's the again, when we enter monastic life, we're actually deliberately setting aside most sources of entertainment. We're deliberately setting aside most of the forms of pleasure, of stimulation, of distraction that lay people engage in. And we're doing so because it creates the space and clarity in the mind for us to delve deeply into spiritual practice and to start to get in touch with a higher happiness. But especially in the early stages of one's practice, when maybe one's meditation is not particularly advanced and one's development of mind is not particularly advanced, then it can be actually quite difficult to access the bliss and the contentment of spiritual practice. And instead, what one is aware of is what one has lost. It's like, oh, I can't watch TV anymore. Oh, I can't play video games anymore. Oh, I can't listen to music anymore. Oh, I can't do this. I can't do that. And then you talk to your old friends from before monastic life, and they're telling you how they went to Burning Man and they had such a great time. And like, oh, there's this new show they've been watching, which is so well done, and the storyline is so great. And oh, and did you read that new book that came out? And you're like, no, that sounds great though. And so very easily the mind starts getting back in that old mode of it's like, well, this meditation's not going so great. I'm not really enjoying monastic life, but the Buddha did give lots of advice for lay people about how you can still make merit and build up the foundations of a spiritual life, but without giving up entertainment and indulgence and all that. So maybe I'll just do that. So I can still go to Burning Man and I'll just make a donation to the monastery once a year, and that'll be enough for this life. Again, this is actually a very common way of thinking, and usually people with this attitude actually don't make it into monastic life in the first place. I've actually met many lay people with exactly this attitude. They're like, well, I'll just keep making merit, and maybe in some future life then I'll get around to being a monk, but there's no point in doing it in this life. Like, I'm too busy enjoying myself. I've got too much to do. But maybe in some future life I'll get around to that whole spiritual practice thing. But it does sometimes come up in monastic life as well, where someone is like, yeah, I'm not having a great, I think it's I'll just go make merit and enjoy what there is to enjoy in the world.
I feel like it's also once again another very human thought that can appear in the mind. Both in one actually is nurturing. I remember in particular, actually, right before I decided to ordain. Right before my ordination, I had gone to Italy to see some of my friends, and it was still the time when we were running this center in New York City, which was a lot of work, and it was retreats back to back, and for quite a few years. Then I had been doing all this work on myself, on my mind, but also like actual physical work, unpaid, without a salary. paid with good karma, but not, with any type of material sort of wealth, not having a room, not having a place, not having a closet where to put things, my belongings, etc. So also kind of a bit of a discomfort physically. And then I went to go and visit my friends in Italy for a period of time. And I used to work in fashion. So, they kind of all have a really nice sort of state of existence back in Italy. My friends from my previous life within this life. And so they invite me to their place on the beach. And I'm there in Tuscany, looking at, this beautiful beach. They're in the, in the house with them, and they're making this really delicious food. And I'm having all these great conversations, and, because we all have the same sort of likes and dislikes, and we're all on the same page. And usually, those kind of conversations are not accessible in monasteries, and usually I'm not surrounded by people. I was not surrounded by people who shared those same interests, or ways of looking at the world or politics and so forth. And it was just such a great state of existence. And I'm like, wait, why am I doing that Buddhism thing again? This is actually really pleasant, kind of sukha. Actually, I'm having a really great time. I think it was Mara that was trying to stray me away from actually going forth. And, was by bringing back that recollection of actually, I've experienced this already. And I've been here for quite some time. I used to live in this country, everything, I was having this job, I was having this life, and it was still unsatisfying. So recollecting the element of dukkha was what then made me realize, it is without a doubt actually a pleasant sort of situation, a pleasant condition, but it's unsatisfying in and of itself. And so there's, it can be very difficult in that respect. Monastic life can be very difficult to live in a monastery, but it is very conducive to, first of all, identify dukkha, and then act in a way that removes that dukkha altogether. But obviously, usually for the average person, usually entering monastic life, it's a downgrade of sensual pleasure. It is a downgrade. So if one doesn't make sure to cultivate really wholesome mind states that are unrelated to sensual pleasures, it can be very difficult to rationalize why one is staying in this sort of context when there is an alternative that is kind of a lot more comfortable, a lot more pleasant. So one needs to really look at the mind and find that whenever these thoughts appear in the mind, it's because we actually need to work a little bit more on actually perhaps our meditation practice, and finding some maybe also Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. And so really making sure that we develop conditions for a sukha, for a happiness that doesn't come from worldly things, because otherwise monastic life will be a big mass of suffering.
Yeah. Okay, and do you want to read the last section?
Yes. So what monastics is fear of sharks? Here some clansperson goes forth out of faith from the home life into homelessness, considering, I'm a victim of birth, aging, and death, of sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. I'm a victim of suffering, a prey to suffering. Surely an ending of this full mass of suffering can be known. Then after they have gone forth thus, when it is morning, they dress, and taking their bowl and outer robe, they go into a village or town for alms, with their body unguarded, with their speech unguarded, with mindfulness unestablished, and with sense faculties unrestrained. They see a woman there, lightly clothed, lightly dressed. When they see such a woman, lust infects their mind. Because their mind has been infected by lust, they forsake the training and revert to the low life. They're called one who has forsaken the training and reverted to the low life, because they were frightened by the fear of sharks. Now, fear of sharks is a designation for women. I think we can replace women with with women, men, or whomever one is attracted to, essentially.
Yeah, the point here is lust rather than a particular body or particular gender. So, and finally, after 4 reasons for disrobing, the Buddha finally comes to the most common one, at least for male monks. This is 95% of the time when a male monk disrobes, it's because of the danger of sharks. This is, again, this is one of the most deeply rooted defilements in the mind, is the craving for sexuality. And so this is something which is incredibly challenging to work with. It's incredibly challenging to overcome. And so one of the things which the Buddha is emphasizing in this section, as well as in the previous one, but in this one it's particularly relevant, is he's talking about entering a village or town without guarding one's body and speech, without establishing mindfulness, without controlling one's sensory fields. This is emphasizing the importance of doing the opposite, of guarding one's body, guarding one's speech, of establishing mindfulness, of restraining one's faculties. So in other words, paying close attention to what one is doing physically. Whenever one is going into a situation where one might encounter enticing or distracting things, whenever one goes into a situation where there are things which might spark one's defilements, which might bring up these underlying defilements of mind, then we need to be very careful not to fixate on anything which is going to increase our defilements. We need to be careful to really carefully watch what we say to people, what kind of conversations we have. Are we engaging in conversations that increase our defilements? Be careful what we do with our body. Where do we go? Are we putting ourselves into situations which are, again, going to be bringing up the wrong kinds of attitudes in our mind? Are we placing ourselves in situations which are inflaming our desire and aversion? And so restraining our sense faculties also then is not fixating on anything which is going to increase our defilements. So in the example here of a person, presumably a person who's attracted to females in this specific example, who sees a scantily clad woman in town, well, the Buddha is not saying there's anything wrong with how that woman is dressed, but rather the problem here is that the person is staring at that person. The problem here is that in this case, the monk is staring at the woman, and as a result of that, then the sexual desire arises and becomes stronger. So the solution here is quite simple. Don't stare at the woman. Like, don't stare at the person who's sexually attractive to you. If you have a problem with sexuality, then don't stare at attractive people. So sense restraint is actually a very straightforward thing. If there's some sensory object which causes an increase in defilements, then don't look at it. Or if you do need to look at it or pay attention to it, then don't fixate on the particular details or characteristics that spark one's defilements. So an example that I gave recently was there was a time many years ago when shortly after I was ordained. The monastery I was staying at, there was this young, extremely attractive person came to the monastery. And it's kind of like whenever this person would walk in the room, like all the monks would be like, like all the eyes would turn. Yet this person had bad teeth. So everything else about them was like stunningly beautiful except their teeth. So my personal practice was whenever this person came in the room, I would stare at their teeth. And in this way, lust did not invade the mind, because how could you possibly have lust for those teeth? So this is an example of one application of sense restraint. So instead of focusing on the aspects of the body that were appealing, instead finding something which does not spark one's defilements, finding some aspect of the experience which is not bringing up one's unwholesome tendencies of mind. And so keeping one's attention away from the details that increase defilement, and instead pointed towards the aspects of the experience that at best reduce the defilements, but at minimum don't increase or inflame them. And again, the gender of the object is not actually the point here. The point is anything which increases one's sexual lust. So you want to keep your mind away from that. If one wants to stay in monastic life, you want to not direct your attention towards things that increase one's obsession with sexuality. Do you have any comments on this section?
Yeah, thank you, Bhante. What comes to mind is also, well, it's very helpful to have an understanding of essentially how our mind works, because we usually are very kind of result oriented immediately, but we actually don't know what's going on to begin with. And so when certain impulses appear in the mind, usually what we want to do is kind of like eliminate it altogether. But instead, if we actually have an awareness of essentially the kind of cycle, the tendency of mind, the habit of mind, then, and we identify that habit of mind, for example, if we see someone who is attractive, etc., and then we also notice how the mind starts creating a story about, possible iterations with the person. Either they will live happily ever after, or blah 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 blah, like all of those kind of stories that the mind can appear. To actually recollect how essentially the same predicament has played out in the past, and how, there was gratification for sure, and then there was the danger, which is why, one is not in a relationship anymore, essentially. And so kind of like we tend to think of the person, of the subject sort of our desire as being, so special. And also that sense of attraction towards that person to be so special. But in reality, it's so banal. Like, it's really just so common. And it's always exactly the same thing, And we tend to think that, there's all these flavors of ice cream, but fundamentally it's just ice cream. And we're always constantly like having ice cream and engaging in ice cream and going like, oh, I'm sure that, if I have vanilla ice cream instead of strawberry ice cream, I'm going to be happy. And then you have vanilla ice cream instead of strawberry ice cream, and it's still dukkha. So then you're like, oh, what about hazelnut ice cream? And then you have hazelnut ice cream and it's dukkha. And you're like, oh, but I'm sure that, I still haven't had, I don't know, pistachio ice cream. So like understanding that, it's very helpful to look at that as a layperson first. And then one can kind of bring that wisdom into monastic life and recollecting that and going like, oh yeah, this is how the mind is sort of going about it again, essentially trying to look for happiness in something that is very unreliable. And then bringing to mind, I feel it's very helpful to bring to mind how instead there are certain people that might be the gender or might have the body that we're normally sort of attracted to, that perhaps are relatives. And so we are not actually attracted to them. So why? What is the difference? How are we relating to our mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, or cousins or whatever? Like, what is it that is radically different? So it's more of an attitude of mind. Actually, there's a sutta that can't remember if it's the Buddha, but someone that encourages actually a monastic to really, start relating to people in a different way rather than as objects of craving. We can actually relate to them as sentient beings who are on the path. And actually this makes life so much more beautiful, where we stop being the subject of other people's craving. We stop looking at others as potential, essentially, things to consume, because that's essentially what it is. It's like, oh, I like that person. Basically, I want to consume that person. but rather instead it's an opportunity to cultivate wholesome mind states together. And that, I think, is on the long term, at least for myself, is something that it just tastes good. It tastes like has that taste of freedom from suffering, rather than like, I don't want this, I don't like this, oh, I don't like this, like oh, I should be a good monastic, I shouldn't have these thoughts. Like, it just can get very more kind of like frustrating, but rather or repressive. But if we actually instead take it as an opportunity to shift the way that we relate to others, actually, it's very, very helpful. And of course, if one has the aspiration of ordaining, one should be really practicing in this way first as a layperson, going to monasteries and stop thinking about all the potential Buddhist mates that one can have, but rather, starting to relate to others in this non-sexual way.
And also, to some extent, these also apply to lay people who are in committed relationships. So if one is in a long-term romantic relationship or married, then towards everybody other than your partner, it's cultivating this non-sexual attitude, this non-sexual kindness and compassion. So not relating to people as objects of sexual desire, but relating to them as fellow sentient beings in this path of purification, this path towards awakening. Actually, another story on this that I want to bring up. So this is not from me, but from a senior monk who I know. And he was on an airplane one time, and he was, and so he got to a seat in the airplane, and then someone came and had the seat next to him, and it was this stunningly beautiful young woman. And at first the monk was like, oh no, how am I going to get through this? Hours and hours sitting next to this extremely distracting person. This is going to be really difficult. And then he was like, wait a minute. And he turned to her and he asked her, how old is your father? And the woman says, oh, my father is however old, say 50 years old. And the monk was like, oh, I'm about that age too. And then he started thinking like, this is my daughter. He started thinking like, I'm sitting next to my daughter. And he said that this completely changed his attitude. So then for the rest of the flight, rather than thinking, I'm sitting next to a stunningly attractive person, instead he's thinking, how would I relate to my daughter if I was sitting next to my daughter on the plane? And he said this completely transformed his attitude. And actually it was a really wonderful plane flight after that. So it's also pointing to how, again, one of the main strategies that the Buddha speaks about in the suttas is to replace an unwholesome thought with a wholesome thought, replacing an unwholesome attitude with a wholesome attitude. So often, rather than like we see something unwholesome and we're like, I'm a bad person, this is horrible, or like, I must crush this as soon as possible. And instead, it's like, how can I turn this into something wholesome? How can I replace this with something better, something more in line with the path? So an example of this story, he saw a way to replace that sexual attitude with a mind of genuine kindness and compassion. So this attitude of parental care. So another way of switching the mind around. And anything else on the sutta, or should we have a look at the questions and comments?
No, also the monastics were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words, so I think we all are too.
Great. So we can 3 sadhus to respect the sutta.
Sadhu,
sadhu, sadhu. And hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to Christina, Gita, still subject to clinging, still. Hello to Stevie, John, Kobe, Yankee, Isa, Yenmoon, Ten, Sud, Avis, Nalin, Abe, Lalit, Tonkam, Siyong, Tora, June, Rick, Kumu, Bhumika, Ushing, Sangtong, Manal, Amaranta, Yoel, Dimitri, JT, Albin, Sumeda, Ranga, and Bill, and Bhavani. Great, wonderful to see so many people joining
We're
in.
satisfied and delighted. Great.
Right? And so Gita says, in many monasteries, the lay community comes to socialize. Seeing this, we try to avoid large ritualistic gatherings. If we do participate, we observe noble silence. Yeah, so the Buddha said when we gather together, we should either talk about the Dhamma or maintain noble silence. So these are our two basic options. And Gita also says, we have heard it said that monastics that disrobe also continue to practice the Dhamma in their lay life. Are they then looked down on by the Sanghas they have chosen to live a lay life? Not necessarily. So first off, we try not to look down on anyone. Instead, we try to practice compassion and recognizing that monastic life is actually quite difficult and challenging. If they're a monk for, say, 5 years and then they disrobe, well, it's not like they just wasted 5 years. In fact, they just spent 5 years extremely well. And that's something to appreciate, that somebody spent 5 years of their life doing something really wholesome. That's great. And that's going to influence the course of the rest of their life. So it's wonderful that they chose to spend 5 years in the monastery. And if they then choose to be a layperson again, well, sometimes, actually every once in a while, that's actually a good choice for someone. Sometimes somebody is really struggling in monastic life and it's just really not working for them and they need to do something different for a while. And it's like, well, okay. Or sometimes somebody's in monastic life for not the best reasons. And eventually it becomes clear to them that their motivation is not quite correct. And they decide that it's not the best thing for them to do. And again, that's okay. It's actually fine for that. Of course, sometimes somebody then switches their motives around and gets on track, and that's of course ideal. But it's not necessarily the case that the other Sangha members will look down on someone who's disrobed. I mean, of course, sometimes that happens. That's human. But ideally, what we do is we appreciate the goodness that person has done and the goodness they continue to do. Usually the person will be encouraged to continue coming to the monastery as a lay practitioner. So to maintain a positive connection with the Sangha. And of course, to do their best to apply the principles of Dhamma to lay life as best as they can. So it's not necessarily the case that someone who disrobes is looked down upon. In fact, often they continue to be a important figure in the monastic life, just on the other side. Okay.
That's good. I think Joe has a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
First, thank you. What came to mind was, you guys had JOMO as an event. You had, fear of missing out and joy of missing out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought it might be good for you guys if you had like an event in the future called Everything is Burning Man. You come to the monastery for a retreat of Everything is Burning Man, so you don't feel like you're missing out on that. Because you have the joy of missing out.
Everything is burning, man. Yeah.
But on a serious note, I wanted to talk about sharks. I'm noticing a pattern in the monastic life where we have to have sense restraint. Right? We don't talk about certain things or we avoid certain ideas. How do we deal with do monks talk about the specifics of lust? Or do we just because it almost seems like sometimes we're ignoring the thing that's, I don't like, what's ignoring it and then what's sense restraint? Because there's certain things that I like, as the more I practice, the more I have this compassion for maybe celibates in other communities. You can the lust is painful. Like there's a point where lust is an irritant, and I can see why in the past you can almost hate the object of your lust, because it feels like, if you don't understand what's happening, you think that they're like somehow hurting you or defiling you just by them being there, because they're constantly in your mind, and you were happy one moment and then they're in the room, or the lustful thought comes and they're suffering. Or like when lustful thoughts happen in your sleep and you have no control, and you feel like you're oppressed by lust, because I just wanted to sleep. I didn't have any intention to have these kinds of experiences. And like, I know the Buddha says those experiences aren't a fault, but how do we have compassion? Like, how can anyone, like, when they really practice the Dhamma, be like, how can I have a relationship with someone when I know the truth is like, the only reason I want to be with you is because it's suffering. You know what I mean? It's like, I can't ask a partner to have that kind of relationship with me. Does that make sense? Like, how do we focus on that?
So you actually touched on several different points there. So first off, I mean, we should always be aware of what's going on in our own mind.
Mm-hmm.
And when living in a celibate environment, if one is struggling, then actually, usually, if you want to talk about it, you go to one of the teachers who's available and you talk to them. It's usually not particularly helpful to just talk to other monastery residents. Like, usually that's not so helpful. Sometimes it actually just winds up making things worse. But with delicate things like that, you would usually go and talk to one of the senior teachers who's available. And yeah, it is quite difficult, because again, we're actually going against one of our strongest and most deeply rooted desires. So it is very challenging. And yeah, I mean, as far as relationships or not, so it's one of the big questions that lay people ask themselves, is whether or not to get involved in relationships. And I'm not a lay person, so my answer is kind of already set on this one. But for lay people, it actually is a serious question. And if one does choose to get into a relationship, then the challenge is how to make that relationship as wholesome as possible. So, of course, there's the component of sexual desire is unwholesome by its nature. But that's not the 100% of what a relationship is. Ideally, a relationship also contains very strong characteristics of compassion and kindness and thoughtfulness and generosity and equanimity and patience and patience and patience. And so learning how to learning how to focus on building up those wholesome and positive qualities in a relationship context. That's actually the main focus for a non-celibate practitioner. It's learning how to make your relationship as wholesome as possible. Learning how to make it a vehicle of the Brahma Viharas, rather than just being all about desire and clinging and attachment and preference, but instead making it a vehicle of the Brahma Viharas.
Thank you.
Thoughts?
No, it's pretty good.
I had a specific, or maybe a more specific question, if I could add on to it. Would that be allowable?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, what, in terms of the actual process, like the actual defilement of lust, right? When we desire something, and then when that thing, either through our own sense restraint or not being able to have the object of desire, why does anger arise? What is the relationship between lust and anger, or like resentment or hate and lust? Are they two ends of the same spectrum?
Well, I mean, desire and aversion are sometimes described as being two sides of one coin, because it's both about wanting something. Desire is about wanting to get something. Aversion is about wanting to get rid of something. So, but in terms of when one doesn't get what one wants, one then feels anger. That's actually quite understandable. You're angry because you didn't get what you wanted. So even though we might have very good reasons for stopping ourselves from pursuing what we want, nonetheless, there's that sense of frustration about not getting what we wanted. And if we don't have some other way of developing a sense of contentment and peace and joy, then the mind is just like, okay, I'm feeling dejected and depressed and downhearted, and just a moment ago I maybe could have had access to something that would be pleasant and soothing, but I also just denied myself access to something pleasant and soothing, and now I have nothing. I'm an idiot. This was so stupid. So the mind can easily start telling ourselves these stories, and yeah, you can very easily get into an anger mode, and this actually is one of the downfalls of, again, taking on celibacy when one's mind doesn't have a certain degree of development, is we can get into these kind of negative cycles. And that's also why the Buddha draws a strong connection between samadhi and celibacy. So when one's samadhi practice is strong, then you actually have a source of happiness and contentment, which is completely apart from sensuality. So that then the fact that you're not accessing sensuality isn't a problem, or isn't as much of a problem. So those are a few thoughts that come to mind. Anything on this?
Yeah, I think that's also why Ajahn Pasanno says that essentially once you understand food, you kind of understand everything else, in the way that we tend to think that they're radically different sort of areas, but it's exactly actually the story that I was telling before. Essentially, when the object of desire, when the Jamaican food or the Chinese food was not available to me, there was lots of anger, lots of frustration. And obviously we have the lawyer, our inner lawyer, that will go like, well, before, I could just like go and have my Chinese food. I would have been happy, or like the Jamaican food, I would have been happy. But that's because we don't experientially know that there's a higher form of happiness. And with the example of then, instead of focusing on focusing on attaining something that that is the object of our desire, but instead we cultivate a different type of happiness, and we're like, wow, it's just innately superior. But not because I read it in a book, but because, wow, I've had Chinese and Jamaican food multiple times, and I never got the same happiness of rejoicing in other people's happiness. It's something that is experiential. It's something that is just beautiful. And then we start understanding also by doing a lot of mindfulness of the body, really like mindfulness of emotions as well. So the physicality, the physical part of the emotions that we're experiencing, we start understanding how we're constantly essentially acting out upon Vedana. So essentially lust is just a bunch of Vedana, to be quite frank. Like hormones is just a bunch of Vedana. Hunger is just a bunch of Vedana. So all of that we just take really seriously, and we appropriate, and we think, okay, this is, who I am. And then it becomes something else. It builds up in our mind. What is very powerful, for example, about Tudong practice is that since you put yourself in such extreme sort of situations, you'll have really extreme Vedana, you'll have really extreme sensations. And they're kind of always all the same. At the very beginning, you will be surprised. Or like, oh, why am I, having all these defilements in the mind? But then after a while, it becomes like predictable, no different than the schedule at a monastery where everything is predictable. Not these days, actually. An empty cloud is a little bit unpredictable, but usually it's very predictable. And then you stop personalizing it. You're like, okay, I didn't have much sleep, so I woke up like irritable. So it's the same thing. Like right now, there's a bunch of hormones going crazy in my body. Oh, there's this type of Vedana. And yeah, it's not me, it's not mine, it's not who I am. And it's easy to abandon something that we understand is not us, so to speak. Or so the sensation is still there, it's just that we don't act upon it. So this is what comes to mind.
Good. And there's a few more questions online. So Gita says, prior to the monastic rules, in the beginning, monastics were able to consume food at any time. And later the rule was put in place due to monastics going after dark for food and lay people being scared, thinking it was a robber. But in a monastery, it's safe. Monastics don't go out for food, especially in very cold weather. Is the rule in place to train one's mind to be restrained?
Yeah, there's a difference between abstaining from something and renouncing from something. So, it's very easy to practice self-restraint with pizza when there's no pizza on the table. But there's another thing is if actually there's pizza there and you actually decide not to take it. So yeah, so I would say all of these rules are, once again, when they're not moral, they're mainly actually opportunities for training the mind. And so, yes, while we were I think we spoke at length actually of all the, the kitchen being all stocked up, and and at the very beginning, the mind going, oh, I so wish that this particular item, were offered, this particular item were presented, and it's not. And then after a while, you have to just confront your mind state and go like, okay, am I going to ruin my entire life like just obsessing about this whatever almond butter, or about this like particular, I don't know, even the salad, might be salad, it's rotting in the fridge, and you're like, this is so stupid. Why are they offering the salad? Like something as silly as that. So there's the choice, or like, okay, either I keep on ruining my life with this, or just let go of this silly thought, and who cares? It's not a big deal. And then you have these glimpses of, the joy of missing out, on craving, essentially.
And Carolina asks, how to deal with our unconscious behavior. I am attentive of my words and actions, yet sometimes my unconscious feels like it betrays me into doing non-self-restraining. Yeah, so this is part of the development of our practice, is that in the early stages of our practice, we are developing some awareness and restraint about our surface level of mind, but our deeper levels of mind still are more or less running on autopilot. And our autopilot is completely deranged. And it takes quite a while for our practice to start to seep into the deeper layers of mind. But it does eventually happen. It just takes years and years and years, and it takes a lot of patience and dedication. But slowly over time, our practice will start to seep into those deeper and deeper layers of mind. And you'll start to become increasingly aware of those subconscious patterns, and also increasingly able to alter and control those subconscious patterns, so that eventually you actually can start to transform the mind on a deep level, so that these negative patterns become weaker and eventually can be overcome entirely. But it takes a very, very long time. So this is a gradual practice. It's a slow practice. So often we want quick results, but there are no quick results. Yeah, give it another 20 years or so, and then you still won't be anywhere near done, but you'll have made a lot of progress.
Maybe it will be done, I think.
That would actually be great. Yeah,
I think you're
it's
doing
possible.
great, Carolina.
Yeah, just keep going. Yeah, and as time goes by, it gets easier. Okay, and there were a couple other comments, but we're vastly over time. So if you have additional questions or comments, you can bring them to this evening's monk chat, and we'll answer all of your Buddhist-related questions and comments this evening. But for now, we can conclude the session with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, and we'll see you next time.